in the past have developed this technique of remotely controlling a car in order to create a car accident that could kill someone.
Absolutely right, yeah.
Now, this gentleman, this is also covered in your book. I find this very interesting. This is Air Marshal Sir Peter Horsley, former equerry to the Queen.
Yeah.
He's now dead.
He is now dead, yeah.
Now, Air Marshal Sir Peter Horsley confirmed that the Boston Brakes method of assassination has been used in Britain, and that he was personally, though unwittingly, involved in an operation that used this so-called Boston Brakes technique.
That's right.
What on earth happened there?
Well, it was the car that Sir Peter Horsley was driving.
Mm-hmm.
This is all according to Sir Peter Horsley. People can buy his book and read this for themselves.
It's called
Sounds from Another Room, yeah. And he was driving his car along the A303 in England, close to Stonehenge, when he noticed a Volvo estate closing on him in his rearview mirror very, very quickly. So he kind of moved over to allow this car to overtake him, but as it overtook him, he noticed his car, he completely lost control of his car, and he felt that it was taken over completely. Mm-hmm. The next thing he knows, he's swerving one way, then another way, back violently across the central reservation, smack into what was obviously the target vehicle, which was driven by a character called Major Michael Marmon, who was the target. And Michael Marmon was killed in this accident. Sir Peter Horsley was very seriously injured, but he survived. But what's also interesting about that particular incident, Chris, is that it's the way in which Sir Peter Horsley's car moved when it was taken over.
Yes.
Because it is identical to what happened to the Mercedes in which Diana died, in that the minute Sir Peter Horsley lost control, the minute Omni Paul lost control, exactly the same thing happened. The car swerved first one way, then the other way, and then back, in Omni Paul's case, into the 13th pillar in that Almont underpass.
Yes.
In Sir Peter Horsley's case, across the central reservation and into the target car. But if you watch computer-generated reconstructions of the crash, certainly Diana's crash, you see specific movement of that car. It's not just taken over and then suddenly it's driven into the pillar. It moves in a very specific way, and it is identical to the way in which Sir Peter Horsley's car was manoeuvred once it was taken over.
Is coming along this road on the left bank of the Seine towards the Alma Bridge. It heads down towards the underpass, and it's estimated at that time it speeds about 70 miles an hour. What happens next is based on the evidence that we have so far. As he comes down into the tunnel, he's faced with a slow-moving Fiat. He steers to the left. Because he's just come over a crest, the steering's light, he probably puts in too much steering, so he's heading towards the centre columns. He corrects right, and now he's heading directly for the Fiat Uno.
The Mercedes sideswiped the Fiat, snapping off its own driving mirror and smashing the Fiat's tail light. So far, just a minor collision. A 106-foot skin mark shows that the Mercedes driver pulled the steering wheel back to the left. Then the car mounted the pavement and smashed head-on into column 13. The car spun round and ended up facing in the direction it had come from. It's thought that the Fiat drove by without stopping.
From the time the car entered the tunnel until it came to rest after the impact, that's only about 2 seconds. Newspapers have talked luridly of speeds of 120 miles an hour, but looking at the damage tells a very different story. It suggests an impact with the pillar of about 60 miles an hour, and we know that the car came to rest about 15 feet from the pillar spinning out, and that means about 10 miles an hour exit speed from the pillar. So the change in velocity was slightly less than 50 miles an hour. And it's that change in velocity which is crucial in terms of the severity of the crash to which the occupants were exposed. This was a severe but a survivable accident, and what we now need to consider is why did 3 people die? Strangely, Princess Diana, sitting where I am in the right rear, had the best chance of survival because the impact was concentrated on the left front of the car, and as it hit the pillar, it also rotated and span out, so she went partly past the pillar and didn't have quite the same crash forces applied to her as happened to the people sitting on the left. If she'd been wearing a seatbelt, she'd have had a fair chance of surviving even this extreme accident. But, unbelted, she was thrown forward to strike the back of the front passenger seat, the door pillar, and then was tossed around after the main accident took place and the vehicle span out.
Apparently, some people have said that the slip road that gives anybody coming towards the tunnel an option of either going through the tunnel or taking the slip road, that particular slip road, apparently, according to some people that saw this, was actually blocked by a motorbike. Do you want to elaborate on that?
It's definitely acknowledged in Lord Stephen's report as well that there was a motorbike parked broadside across the slip road off of the road, as you say. So Omni Paul was unable to
he had no
take
choice.
that. No, he had no choice but to go through the tunnel. In order to get back to Dodie's apartment, he needed to take that slip road off. So it wasn't just an option; it was a necessary one. He should have taken that. Given the fact that he'd gone this wrong way, as it were, the way back to Dodie's apartment was to take this slip road off of the road he was on. But he couldn't. Now, what Lord Stephen says is that Omni Paul was going too fast anyway, so that's why he didn't take it, even though the report does acknowledge that this motorbike was parked broadside across there, blocking his way. And it's not true to say Omni Paul was going too fast. The reason he sped up and carried on through the tunnel is precisely because this motorbike was blocking his path off of the road.
Now, am I right in saying that there were no witnesses at all to the actual moment when the Mercedes smashed into the pillar?
Aside from those who caused the crash, there were no witnesses at all. No, there's a fair number of witnesses to events immediately after and over the first few minutes after the crash, but there were no public witnesses to the crash itself.
But there are certainly witnesses who saw what was going on at the mouth, the entrance to the tunnel.
Yeah.
One of those is a gentleman called Mr. Hunter.
Gary Hunter was staying in a hotel kind of overlooking the exit route from the tunnel. He couldn't quite see the tunnel from his bedroom window, but what he did see was immediately after the crash. He heard 2 explosions in the tunnel. He was interested. He looked out of his window, couldn't quite see the tunnel from his window, but what he did see a few seconds later was a small Fiat Uno type car. It was very dark, remember, for him, and he was looking down, but he saw a Fiat Uno type car followed bumper to bumper by a Mercedes, he said, speeding away from the tunnel as though they were really, really trying to get away from someone. This is a London lawyer. This is not someone who's just, making up stories. He was there.
Now, what I find so interesting about that is that there's a direct contradiction as far as the movements of that white Fiat Uno. Let's say it definitely was a white Fiat Uno, because there's one report of the white Fiat Uno virtually at a standstill, loitering at the entrance to the tunnel, and then there's Mr. Hunter saying that after the crash, and obviously those explosions that he heard, I would imagine are the amplified sounds in a closed-in space of the car going to the pillar. And it seems that the Uno was loitering almost at a standstill at the entrance, and then just few seconds later it was seen speeding off.
Indeed, yeah.
And I am right in saying, aren't I, that neither the car nor the person driving that car has ever been positively
Identified or traced. No, that's absolutely right. And also interestingly, moments before that, the Fiat Uno was seen loitering at the entrance to the tunnel. It was seen by an off-duty police officer speeding towards the tunnel. So what had happened was the Fiat Uno had sped towards the tunnel at quite some speed, overtaking the off-duty police officer en route. A few moments later, as the off-duty police officer, David Laurent, approached the tunnel, he saw the same Fiat Uno that had come to what he called a virtual standstill at the tunnel, like you say, loitering at the entrance there. And then half a minute after the crash, Gary Hunter saw the same car speeding away from...
Now that's not normal driving, is it?
It's not normal driving, and when we interviewed Professor Murray Mackay, that's a precise phrase he used almost. He said there was some very abnormal driving that night with regard to the Fiat Uno itself, because you imagine if you're coming into the Almar tunnel, the crash tunnel, Diana's Mercedes comes up behind you, it clips your rear wing, you're in a tiny little Fiat Uno.
There's paint from an Uno on the Mercedes.
On the Mercedes, so we know, and it's acknowledged in both the French and the British reports that the Mercedes clipped the Uno on the way in. You're hit by a ton of speeding Mercedes.
4 tons of...
Okay, 4 tons of speeding Mercedes in a little tin can Fiat Uno. 2 seconds later, that Mercedes crashes full on into a pillar in front of you, spins around 180 degrees in front of you, and you have the presence of mind not to make any kind of correction manoeuvre that would leave a skid mark on the road. You wouldn't put your foot on the brakes. You just carry on. This is the Uno driver. There were no tyre marks or skid marks made by the Fiat Uno.
And then Mr. Hunter sees that car
speeding away from the tunnel about a half a minute later.
Now, would you say that, you know, judging on all the other things that have come forward and us putting this incident all together, that would it be likely that perhaps the person who was remotely controlling the Mercedes, if indeed the Boston Bricks method was being used, might likely have been sitting in that white Fiat Uno?
I think that is almost definitely the case, yeah, I would say so.
And no members of the public actually saw the impact of the Mercedes hit the pillar?
No. No one's come forward to say so.
But the person inside the Fiat Uno would most certainly have had the best view of that incident.
Absolutely, because it happened right in front of his eyes.
It is absolute black and white, horrendous murder.
We turn our attention to some interesting characters that just happened to be either stationed or just happened by chance to be in Paris that night.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware, there were some people with connections to the British establishment in terms of MI5 or MI6, and they were in Paris that night. Do you want to just give us a little list of all these interesting characters that all of a sudden seemed to be in Paris the same night that Diana was killed?
Well, we certainly know that 2 characters called Richard Spearman and Nicholas Langman were in Paris that night at the British Embassy. We now know for sure. There were always kind of speculations that they were MI6 officers. We now know for certain they were MI6 officers. In fact, Richard Spearman was formerly private secretary to the chief of MI6, so he was a very senior MI6 officer at the embassy that night.
So one of Britain's most senior MI6 officers was at the British Embassy the night that Diana died.
Indeed, yeah.
Am I right in also saying that there were extremely senior French officials actually in the tunnel?
Yes, there were. Yeah, we know that the chief of police was there. Some